Good evening. So we're continuing to look at the practice of patience. And for one to be able to actually practice patience, one needs to cultivate this attitude of patience, independence on using reasoning. So last week we saw an illustration given, or we saw a further reason presented that when others do wrong, when they perhaps act unskillfully towards us or others, to recognize that they are doing so under the control of the afflictions. Being controlled by the afflictions, they have no autonomy or free will. Therefore, being controlled by these consciousnesses which afflict their mind, they will accumulate non-virtue, and they will engage in practice in harmful behavior, perhaps even take their own life. So recognizing this then, truly recognizing this then, we'll see independence on that reason, that it makes no sense to be angry, to even be upset or frustrated when people act unskillfully, when they do wrong, recognizing that they are enslaved by their afflictions. And therefore, recognizing that under the control of their afflictions, they are causing themselves harm. And therefore, the only adequate response is patience and compassion. So that is the first response, which is to recognize that in relation to them, one should all that's suitable is to give rise to patience and compassion. And then the second response is to strengthen one's motivation, one's determination to abandon the afflictions oneself, seeing this display before you of the harm that they do. Strengthen your determination to abandon them yourself, so as to gain freedom and be able yourself and be of ever greater benefit to others. Then the 37th verse, when controlled by the afflictions, they even kill their cherished selves, then how can they be expected not to harm the bodies of others? Looking at the first two lines, when controlled by the afflictions such as anger, attachments and pride, arising within one, they control, one comes under their control. One's mind being afflicted by the consciousnesses such as anger, attachment and pride, they control us. We have no free will, no autonomy. The second line then points to that they even kill their cherished selves. So cherished self then refers to that we are guided by the wish for the attainment of our own happiness, because we hold ourselves as dear. But when this desire for our own happiness is mixed with the controlling minds of the afflictions, being now so deluded by these delusions, or so our mind being so afflicted by the afflictions, we may even end up taking our own life. So these first two lines present a reason, and by understanding and taking this reason to heart, so putting it in one's mind so that it influences how we relate and respond to what we encounter, we will recognize that when people are under the influence of their afflictions, or maybe are under the control or the power of their afflictions, they, not having any free will, they end up destroying what they value most, the attainment of their own happiness, and perhaps even engage in self-harm or take their own life. So when we really take this to heart, then when we see someone under the influence of the afflictions, even if it's not something as extreme as taking their own life, we recognize that they are creating the causes for their own suffering. So they are destroying their own yearned for happiness. So therefore, even if the afflictions aren't so extreme as leading to suicide, when someone is influenced under the control of the afflictions, one recognizes the only response is patience and compassion for them. Moreover, when they act under the influence of the afflictions towards others, now the third and fourth line, then how can they be expected not to harm the bodies of others? Having taken these first two lines and the reasoning behind there to heart, we recognize that if someone is going to destroy their own actions because they're under the control of the afflictions, and they end up destroying their own happiness, even taking their own life, of course they're going to harm the happiness of others, or even the lives of others. That, of course, will happen. If they're going to destroy what they cherish most, they will, they will very easily harm others too. So therefore, with this reasoning, we can, it strengthens our understanding that the only response to the harm that others cause is compassion and patience. But what is presented, or the way this text is presented, and certainly here, are various reasons are presented upon which the Bodhisattva trains their mind. Because Bodhisattvas, being of sharp intelligence, being highly intelligent, rely on using reasons to deeply transform their way of thinking. So here the Bodhisattva recognizes that beings dominated by ordinary attitudes like self-cherishing, they will strive first and foremost to solve their own problems, first, to protect their dear selves first. This is normal. So if they are going to make sure that they are that an ordinary being looks after their own situation first, there's no question that in this process of defending themselves, protecting themselves, achieving their own happiness, harm can come to others. And ordinary people will easily justify that and easily dismiss this. In other words, by using reasons, the Bodhisattva will understand that beings will, in order to protect themselves or to achieve their own happiness, will engage in unskillful behavior that directly or indirectly leads to harm to others. And most people will be quite comfortable with that. They'll justify it and excuse it quite easily. So in dependence on such reasoning, then, it's very clear to the Bodhisattva that the only worthwhile response or suitable response to seeing beings engaging in harmful behavior is patience and compassion. And to get to this point that this is a natural response, then they need to meditate in the way presented here, based on many reasons. The 38th verse. For those who due to the arisal of afflictions engage in suicide, murder and so forth, if I cannot give rise to vast compassion for them, why should anger have the final word? So look at the first two lines. For those who due to the arisal of afflictions engage in suicide, murder and so forth. So in my translations I've written, so for those who due to the arisal of afflictions. So this due to links to what has come before. So it's not so explicit in the translation, but there are a few Tibetan words linking to what has come before. In other words, when under the control of the afflictions, or when the mind is afflicted or deluded due to attachment, anger, pride and so forth, then of course beings will accumulate non-virtue. And they will also engage in self-destructive behavior. They may even take their own lives. Such as self-destructive behavior, in the second line, such as murder, or taking their own life, such as suicide, and so forth. And so forth then can be other expressions of self-destructive behavior, perpetuating harmful habitual tendencies, as well as the accumulation of non-virtue. So this verse, as we see, is very similar to the verse that we've just looked at. It comes down to training oneself to recognize that despite beings yearning for happiness, being under the control so often of their afflictions, being under the control or power of their afflictions, they are suffering right now. And with an afflicted or deluded mind, they are acting in a way that they are desperately trying to dispel suffering, but are actually accumulating the causes to suffer even more in the future. And perhaps they are even harming those that they care for so. So therefore the only valid response is compassion and care for them. So for example, if someone is speaking harshly or unkindly to us, belittling us, talking down to us, berating us, the only valid response is recognizing that this person is merely expressing their desperation to be free of suffering, but in this unskillful way that's just leading to the strengthening of their suffering experiences. The only response that's worthy is one of gentleness and concern for this suffering being before you. If one responds with anger, then one really is acting in the same way as them. Due to one's habituation to the afflictions, one's mind becomes deluded by these delusions or afflicted by these afflictions, and thereby desperately trying to push away one's suffering, one actually just creates causes for evermore. So therefore, recognizing with one's intelligence the faults of responding in a similar way, train the mind to respond only with compassion and care. So these two lines then enforce our understanding of why beings acting the way they do, and it enforces that there is only two worthy responses. So these were mentioned last week and mentioning again now. The one being in response to this suffering being, the only suitable response is compassion and care. The second is to recognizing that this before one is a display of the afflictions at work. This person before one, their mind has become afflicted, and therefore they are suffering, and that suffering is being expressed perhaps through what they're saying or how they're acting. But they are in pain and expressing that pain. So the fault here is not the person, but the afflictions. So in terms of the afflicted person before you, the fault is not with the person, but with these temporary afflictions, these afflictions which have come about in dependence on causes. So this then is part of the second response. The first was compassion for this suffering being. The second response is seeing this display of the afflictions, having it presented before me just how harmful and destructive they are. I have to abandon the afflictions in my own continuum, because as long as they abide within me, even when they are not manifest, when they're not dominating me, I am always in danger of creating the causes of my own suffering and bringing suffering into the lives of others. I have to abandon these afflictions, and moreover, by abandoning the afflictions, I can become an ever more skilled guide for others, and eventually become a Buddha to help others. So this then is the second response. When one comes across the afflicted behavior of others, to recognize, to take this as added determination to abandon one's own afflictions. Moreover, the common response to when others act in a harmful manner or speak in a harmful manner is we criticize, we complain. We probably talk to others about what we experience, or certainly mentally we criticize and complain. This is not skillful at all. The skillful response, the response that will come if one reflects well in this way, is to understand that this being before you is suffering. Why am I criticizing this person? They're not at fault. They are overwhelmed by their afflictions. If I'm going to criticize anything, it's the afflictions, not the person. So there's no point in criticizing and complaining and gossiping about others and what they say and do. Rather, the only response is to generate compassion and based on patience for them, and in relation to ourselves, this determined attitude to abandon our afflictions, to gain freedom from our afflictions for our own good, and so that we can be of ever greater benefit in the lives of others. The third and fourth line. If I cannot give rise to vast compassion for them, why should anger have the final word? So even whilst we are training, compassion may well not spontaneously arise, but at the least we should refrain from retaliating in a similar manner directly to them or indirectly talking about them. We should refrain from speaking or acting out of anger ourselves. So the final words in the fourth line, it's in English will be the why, and then the final word. This is an unusual construction. So to explain the term, the final word. So this can also be expressed as the conclusion to something. And this this has the connotation of making a commitment or a promise, something like this. So a conclusion of something, a commitment to do or not to do something. So in this case, it's in relation, as is translated, why should anger be the final point or the conclusion, have the final word in this interaction between oneself and someone else? And here there's one word before, which we have at the beginning, the word why. And that points to that this is presented as a rhetorical question. Why should anger have the final word? Why should that be how we walk away from this interaction? Perhaps having expressed anger, or even if it's not, if we haven't expressed our anger, we feel it in our mind. We're walking away criticizing, complaining, upset about this interaction. Why should that be how we end our interaction? To summarize this verse and the previous verse, we see that they link very closely also with the verses that we looked at last week and the week before. In that, we saw a couple of weeks ago, there's a verse about how everything is under the power of other factors. Therefore, nothing or no one has their own free will or autonomy. So that was a verse a couple of weeks ago. We saw there that when the mind is under the control of the afflictions, then one's behavior is controlled by those afflictions, one's way of thinking and therefore speaking and acting. For this reason, beings, despite yearning for happiness, they create the causes for further suffering. Immediately suffering due to being the arisal of the afflictions, and through the accumulation of karma, they're creating causes for future suffering, and through the expression of these afflictions, they spread suffering to those around them. And through being under the control of the afflictions, as in verses we looked at last week, that beings, if the line went, so as to attain a partner and so forth, beings engage in destructive or dangerous behavior, such as starving themselves. So this is an illustration of under the influence of afflictions, thinking that you are going to achieve happiness by doing something such as starving oneself or to make oneself physically attractive, one actually is engaging in harmful behavior, thinking that this will bring a desired response. Or, as we saw in these verses, that one may engage in taking one's own life, something we value so as suicide, or taking the life of others, because of being under the control of the afflictions. Or to express the same meaning but in a more general way, under the control of the afflictions, with no autonomy or free will, one engages in self-destructive, harmful behavior. And in so many of these instances, it is just through this expression of the afflictions acting out under their control, one is just strengthening the self-destructive behavioral patterns. And we see this in others, we see this in ourselves. And this comes despite yearning for happiness and freedom from suffering. Beings give rise to the afflictions so easily, and under their influence end up strengthening their harmful habitual patterns, despite yearning to be free of them. They keep perpetuating this cycle. So when we're observing this, and one further point also that was mentioned last week, under the influence of the afflictions, when the mind is deeply disturbed, beings often out of desperation for respite from pain, from this mental anguish, will try and dull themselves by either drinking a lot of alcohol or taking prescription or illegal drugs to try and dull their pain. But this does not solve anything. So recognizing this behavior, we see that there are only worthwhile responses, or responses worthy of a practitioner of Dharma, is in relation to afflicted beings, oneself and others, is to have a response of compassion. Response of compassion comes about independence on the mind of patience, which itself comes about independence on reasoning, understanding that an afflicted person, whether oneself or others, is merely acting out this habitual pattern of the afflictions, creating these ongoing or strengthening these ongoing self-destructive, harmful behavior patterns. Recognizing that, one's mind stays patient, and compassion for suffering beings will naturally arise. In this way, we recognize the beings, despite yearning for happiness, just seem to keep making their situation worse, perpetuating this wheel of suffering that they have created, that they have bound themselves to. When you've taken this to heart, compassion for suffering beings is our only natural response. Those two verses, in 37 and 38, sit together and with what we looked at before. Now the next two verses are a pair. So as I've just mentioned, when we see the behavior of an afflicted being, if we've used our intelligence well, we recognize it's not the person. This is their afflictions, the expression of their afflictions. So if we're going to point our finger of blame at something, it is the afflictions. And this point then is made further in the next two verses, the 39th and 40th, which is looking at whether beings are bad by nature, or whether that their faults that are merely temporarily arising, or the faults are adventitious. So of the two verses, the first 39. If inflicting harm on others is the nature of the childish, anger at them is as inappropriate as anger at fire for being naturally burning. So looking at the first two lines, if inflicting harm on others is the nature of the childish. So perhaps explain the word childish first. So childish refers to those who are spiritually immature. And here, as in often the case, it refers to those who haven't achieved a path in their mind. So anyone who has not yet achieved a spiritual path in their mind are the spiritually immature. So why is this term then, this particular term, immature or childish, used? Because without having cultivated a path, our level of spiritual development can be likened to a child, in that one does not yet really know what should be done and what should be avoided, what should be adopted, what should be abandoned. We are like children, and we think here really talking about toddlers, and probably toddlers, where they're rushing around, touching everything, probably putting it in their mouth. And they are doing this because they are still in the process of learning. So it's not that they are in their nature bad or stupid. It's merely they are naturally doing something because they know no better yet. They may have been told, they may have been told many times, but they haven't yet taken it to heart to the point where it has a lasting impact on their behavior. So they still touch things that they perhaps shouldn't, or put them in things in their mouth that they perhaps shouldn't. So this is the meaning of childish, and childish in this context, that it refers to those who who haven't taken to heart what should be done, what will lead to happiness and what will lead to suffering. Therefore, keep engaging in behavior that does not lead to desired outcomes, that does not lead to lasting happiness. And this is not because, like with young children, It's not because they are bad by nature or stupid by nature, but rather they naturally do not know. They have not yet learnt. And again, here learnt would be not just merely having been told, but where it has been taken to heart and changed their behavior. And this understanding, this use of the word childish can actually fits very well, because in society it is reasonable to expect different behavior from adults than from children or the childish. So for example, when kids get excited and they make a lot of noise, or they get upset and they make a lot of noise, this we understand. They're little children. This is what little children do. Adults, though, we don't expect that behavior from them. We expect them to have matured beyond acting like a toddler. And that is really the meaning here, but in relation to the afflictions. There are those who are spiritually immature, the childish. And this refers to those who have not yet cultivated a path. So for them, the afflictions are still very strong. They are dominated by these afflictions. Therefore, they naturally engage in afflicted behavior. They naturally cause harm. In the third and fourth line, we see in the third line, firstly, that anger at the childish for acting like children is inappropriate. Just like a toddler acting like a toddler is what one would expect, the spiritually immature acting like the spiritually immature should be what we expect. Getting angry at them is inappropriate. And it would be like, now the fourth line, being as anger at fire for being naturally burning. So if we burn ourselves, of course we're in pain. We may be upset that we burnt ourselves, but it would be foolish to be angry at the fire itself for being hot. It would make no sense to be angry at fire for being so hot and expecting fire to not be so hot. That would be a bit stupid. So likewise, being angry at the spiritually immature for acting like spiritually immature people makes no sense. Or to express it differently, angry at those who are afflicted as acting as afflicted beings makes no sense. And then again, I just explained this word in our fourth line, it's translated as anger, and other translations it's translated as resentment. It's an ancient word. It's close to resentment in its spelling, but the meaning is actually anger. Hence, in many translations, it's translated as resentment, but it's meant to be anger. So as I said right at the beginning of this class, Bodhisattvas train by using reasoning to transform their very way of thinking and therefore responding. So here the reason is that it is natural for afflicted beings to respond in an afflicted way. It is not, though, in their nature, but it is natural. So that was the 39th verse, where we looked at if beings are bad by nature, or if their faults, now we come to the next verse, or if their faults are temporary or adventitious, or are translated as incidental. So the 40th verse, or should this fault be incidental and sentient beings be of good nature, in that case anger is still inappropriate, just like anger at the sky for being permeated by smoke. Looking at the first three lines, so the firstly starts with or, so this shows that this verse, the 40th, goes with the 39th, presenting one scenario and now the converse. Should this fault be incidental, so it's not part of the potentially the being's nature, but it's incidental or temporary, usually translated as adventitious. The meaning is it has come about independent on causes, so it's an affliction that has arisen independent on a number of causes and conditions. So this is the case. Should this fault be incidental and sentient beings be of good nature? So in other words, the affliction is not in the nature of the being. It does not therefore define the being as being afflicted, as being angry or desirous and so forth, or proud by their very nature. Rather, it's something that in dependence on causes and conditions has merely arisen, is incidental. Then, the third line, in that case, anger is still inappropriate. So if we recognize this affliction, anger, attachment, pride, it's incidental, causes have been met, and therefore it's arisen. It is not a reflection of who this being is by their very nature. It's temporary, it's adventitious, it's incidental. Therefore, getting angry is inappropriate. Then Shantideva makes his point with an example. Just like anger at the sky for being permeated by smoke, or it's still inappropriate, just like anger at the sky for being permeated by smoke. Smoke arises in dependence on causes and conditions. And if the clear blue sky is obscured by smoke, being angry at the sky is inappropriate. It makes no sense. Similarly, beings who in their very nature are not afflicted, being angry at them because they've merely encountered the relevant causes that has led to the arisal of an affliction that has dominated them and now is being expressed. Being angry at them equally makes no sense. Because it makes no sense to be angry at someone when what we are angry at them about is not who they are. It does not define them. They are not proud. They are not angry. They are not desirous. Rather, that is an incidental or temporary affliction that has arisen due to various causes and conditions coming together. That is all. It does not define them. Rather, as we saw in the second line, sentient beings are good of nature. So we started last week with the previous two verses to look at the third division of the threefold division of patience. This is the patience of disregarding harm from others. The Bodhisattvas do not get angry in response to the harm others inflict upon them. And the reason they do not get angry is because they have trained their mind in dependence on many reasons. And here Shantideva tonight, as well as last week, has introduced a number of reasons. So these we need to learn and to reflect on them, reflect on our own lived experience, coming to recognize the validity of these reasons so that it starts to become ever more our natural response, a response free of anger, but rather of a response dominated by patience, compassion, and wisdom, the wisdom of understanding the situation at hand. So Bodhisattvas will train in the recognition that beings, especially as we saw tonight, the childish or the spiritually immature, they have no free will. Their mind is dominated by the afflictions. The afflictions arise so easily in dependence on causes and conditions and dictate their thoughts and their speech and their physical behavior. Secondly, that being spiritually mature, or they are spiritually mature because they do not know what are the causes of happiness and suffering. They may have heard intellectually, but because of the strength of the habituation to the afflictions, they act contrary to how they would like to behave. They respond in harmful habitual ways. So this is the second reason, that they do not know any better. They're spiritually immature. They engage in habitual responses that do not lead to the fulfillment of the wish for happiness, but just further suffering. Thirdly, that the afflicted response is not an expression of their nature. It is not an expression of who they are. Rather, fourthly, this just a mere arisal of an affliction that is temporary. It will pass. And the affliction has come about in dependence on causes and conditions. It is not the person. The person is not defined by their way of thinking, even if they are deeply habituated. They are not pride does not define them, anger does not define them, and so forth. And it's for these reasons that we recognize that beings, so this will be this is then the fifth reason. Because of these preceding four, beings will harm and even destroy what they value most. They will engage in self-destructive behavior, they'll engage in substance abuse, they'll engage in self-harm, they may even commit suicide. And if they're going to do all this harming what they value most, of course they're going to harm others. Therefore, there's no reason to be surprised when beings act or speak in unskillful ways. And the conclusion is, the only valid response when understanding all of this is a mind that is undisturbed in the face of adversity, in other words, patience. And this patience response enables the arisal of compassion and wisdom. Compassion meaning that one responds in a way to ease their suffering. Wisdom also expressed as the determination for oneself to gain freedom from the afflictions, so as to be of ever more benefit. So these are some of the reasons that Shantideva has presented by which a bodhisattva trains themselves. This bodhisattvas become these greatly skilled practitioners by reflecting in these ways presented here, by relying on many reasons. It's not a mere aspiration or expression of the wish that, oh, I don't want to be angry, I don't want to harm others, I want others to be happy. It's not a mere expression of a wish, but that it is a way of thinking that has been developed independent on reasons. This is the way of thinking. When you understand the causes and the results, one understands and understands all the details of the workings by which a particular result comes, one then will have the inner resolve and inner skill not to engage in harmful behavior, but to engage in skillful, virtuous behavior. For the bodhisattva, really it comes down to them coming to a clear recognition of the faults of the afflictions. For us as immature beings, it's much more likely that we'll be spurred to practice patience because we don't want to suffer some kind of loss. For example, we don't want to suffer. But for the bodhisattva, they have come to a clear recognition of the grave danger that the afflictions pose to all beings, all ordinary beings, themselves and others. So they will have reflected repeatedly in the ways mentioned here, now summarized in the previous segment, taking illustrations from their own lived experience. And they will keep coming back to the same response, that the only appropriate response to suffering beings is patience, compassion, and wisdom. And secondly, a strengthening of my determination to gain freedom of the afflictions myself, so that I can be of ever greater help to others. And this may well be expressed by the bodhisattva in the aspiration of, may all beings, so myself and all beings, gain freedom from their afflictions. And I will do this by taking care of my own mind so as not to come under the influence of the afflictions. So this is something that we can do. Train our mind, watch our mind, and to ensure that if the afflictions arise, that at the very least we refrain from acting under their influence. And then later we purify the arisal of the affliction by recognizing the faults of the afflictions. And we do this in order so that we can spiritually develop in order to be of ever more benefit to others. So this is how we can train like bodhisattvas. All these, using these reasons here, training our mind to guard against afflictions so that we can develop ourselves to be of ever more benefit. So the essence of tonight's presentation, what we need to take away, is to strive to recognize the faults of the afflictions, to develop a deep renunciation towards the afflictions, this committed attitude to watch my mind and ensure that I don't give rise to that the afflictions, I don't allow them to arise, and if they do, I don't act under their influence. And this comes about through recognizing that the only function the afflictions have is to cause suffering. They cause the afflicted person to suffer in the moment, and to create the causes that will lead to further suffering in this life and lives to come. And moreover, through the expression of the afflictions, that afflicted person brings suffering into the lives of others. And it's these afflictions that create our suffering realms of samsara. And it's the abandonment of these afflictions that destroy one's individual samsara. So therefore, we come to the conclusion, I have to strive, like the Bodhisattvas do, to take care of my own mind in order to have, at the very least, not harm others. But through my spiritual growth, where I eventually become a mature spiritual practitioner, I can be of great benefit to others and lead them to their own liberation from suffering. Then thank you, and we can conclude therefore tonight. Thank you.